Today we are starting a sermon series on the end times, the end of it all. And I want to share with you at the outset of this series how I'm praying that God will use this. My prayer is that God will use this series on the end times to bring encouragement and hope, even excitement about what lies ahead. Because I don't know about you, I can only speak for myself. One of the things that this pandemic has reminded me of is how uncertainty can make life really tough. When things are changing so rapidly and you don't know what tomorrow holds, much less next week or next month or next year, uncertainty makes life tough. I remember when this thing first started back in March, I gathered the staff around in a socially distanced room, and I said, guys, we need to prepare for this thing to last through Mother's Day. Well, okay. Well, Mother's Day is long gone, and we're still dealing with this pandemic. What I'm saying is planning, trying to think long term is very, very frustrating when you can't be sure of what tomorrow is going to bring. Uncertainty makes life tough. But those of us who believe in the Bible, although we can't know what's next necessarily, we can know what's last. We can know the end of the story. While we may not know what's going to happen between now and then, when the then gets here, we can be absolutely sure. We can be absolutely sure how all of this thing turns out because God has said much about it. And over the next several weeks, I want to share with you some events that will take place in the end times that you can absolutely hang your hat on. They will happen because God has declared it. Now, I do want to give you a warning, okay? I'm going to warn you against only coming to the first 2 or 3 of these messages. Please stay with us the entire time. If you only come to 1, 2, or 3 of these things, you might leave depressed, okay? If I can cut to the chase, if I can cut to the end is great news for believers. It's great news for believers. We win. And we can bank on that. We can take that to the bank. But here's what I want to do. I want to share with you some things in order, events that will take place in the end times. Here's one final disclaimer, and then I'll dive in. Here's the disclaimer. There are good, godly, smart people who have different views, especially as it relates to the order in which these events take place. Now, I'm going to share with you the sequence that I believe best aligns with a literal interpretation of Scripture. If it matters to you, it's also the most popular Protestant position. But just know that there is some discussion around the order of these events, but there is much greater agreement that these events are in fact going to take place in the end times. Now, to do this, I want to give you a framework for the sermon series, and I'm going to do this in terms of a timeline. That's what the video wall back here is for. The timeline to the left goes all the way back to ages past. Long before the world was ever created, ages past. The timeline goes forward to ages to come, eternity. It is literally an eternal timeline, eternity past, eternity future. Now, to get us all on the same starting point, the first event we'll plot on this timeline is Christ's first coming to earth. This is the series of events where Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came to earth. He was born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, died on a cross, 3 days after that rose from the dead, and then shortly after that ascended back to heaven to the right hand of the Father. Christ's first coming, that took place about 2,000 years ago. Shortly after the events surrounding Christ's first coming, we entered what is known as the church age. The church age. We've been in the church age now for about 2,000 years. The church age began after Jesus ascended back to heaven. Another way to say that is you won't find the church anywhere in the Old Testament. You know why? Because it didn't exist. In fact, while Jesus was here on earth, he said, I will build, future tense, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And that, in fact, took place shortly after Jesus ascended back to heaven. The Holy Spirit came and we entered the church age. Now, the church age is, as you might suspect, about the church. God established the church to proclaim the gospel throughout the world and to make disciples of all nations. This is where we are today. Now, looking forward from here, the Bible describes many events that are to come. One of those events is the rapture of the church. The rapture of the church. We're going to deal quite a bit with this next week. The rapture of the church is that event where Jesus himself will descend from heaven to the clouds and call up all of his saints, all of those who are in Christ, both living and dead, to meet him in the air. And we will be with him forever. The rapture of the church. The Bible also describes, as part of the end times, a 7-year period called the Tribulation. The Tribulation is a 7-year period of time during which God will pour out his wrath on this world. We'll look at this in a couple of weeks. God will literally pour out his wrath on the world. And during this 7-year period of time, a world leader will arise that we know as the Antichrist. And he, empowered by Satan, will rule over the entire world during this 7-year tribulation. The 7-year tribulation, church, will literally be hell on earth. But the Bible then describes a glorious event, Christ's second coming. Jesus is coming back again to this earth to rule and to reign on earth. Now, at the rapture, Jesus comes in the clouds for his people. At the second coming, Jesus comes to the earth, specifically to the Mount of Olives, with his people. And it's at this time that Jesus himself will finally capture and do away with Satan, the Antichrist, and all the evil in the world. And Jesus will set up a period of peace on the earth where he will reign. We refer to that period as the Millennium. There are two other events, there are many other events, but two others that I'm going to talk about over the next several weeks. There are some judgments that are in the future. In church, I want to talk with you about two of those. First, we're going to talk about the judgment seat of Christ. It is a judgment described in the Bible. Sometimes it's referred to as the Bema seat judgment. We're going to talk about that. Then there's another judgment called the Great White Throne Judgment that we will also deal with in the last week of the series. That is a framework. That is a roadmap of where we're going. We're going to deal with each of these events one by one so that we can know, regardless of what happens between now and the end, we can know for sure what's coming and how it all ends. But before we jump into these events starting next week, I want to spend the time that I have left answering the question. When I say the question, it's the question that always comes up when you have any discussion about the end of the world. That question, of course, is when? When is this going to happen? When does the end begin? Are we talking minutes or hours or days or weeks or months or years? Are we talking decades or centuries? How close are we? How close are we to the end of this current age? Well, it's a good question, and it's not a new question. In fact, I want to share with you a conversation as we start. By the way, we're going to be looking at a lot of different scriptures. They'll bring them up all on the screen. I want to share with you a conversation that Jesus was having with his disciples. This is found in Matthew chapter 24. In verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" What did the disciples want to know? The disciples wanted to know back then what you and I would love to know right now. How close are we to the beginning of the end? We've been waiting for 2,000 years now. Are we close, or are we still a long way from the end? Now, to kind of relieve the tension, I want to fast forward the conversation Jesus had with his disciples and share with you the way Jesus ultimately answered the question. You have to go all the way down to verse 36 to find the answer. Jesus says a lot of things, and then he says, "But about that day or hour," which is what you ask about the day or hour, "no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Jesus, how close are we to the end? When is all of this going to happen? And Jesus' answer is, nobody knows. So here's what that means to you practically. Next time you're in a bookstore and you see a book written by someone claiming to know when the end of the world is, you don't need to waste your money. Why do we know that? Because nobody knows except God the Father when the end is going to take place. But here's what's fascinating about Matthew chapter 24. It's fascinating to me, at least, that verse 36 didn't immediately follow verse 3. In other words, the disciples said, "Jesus, when is all this going to happen? When is the end coming?" Jesus could have just said what he said in verse 36. He could have said, "Nobody knows. The angels don't know. I don't know. Only God the Father knows." Jesus could have cut right to the chase and answered their question, but he didn't. You know what he did instead? Jesus described what these events are going to look like. And Jesus isn't the only one who did so. In fact, the Bible has a lot to say about these events, what they're going to look like, what's going to happen at the end of the world. So while Jesus doesn't give us a time, he does give us a description of events. And here's where I'm going with this. Jesus and other Bible writers' descriptions of these end-time events point to indicators that must be present, must be true before the end of time events can take place. Here's an example. Let's say you go to a play. Okay, it's a play you're familiar with. You know what it's about. You're very familiar with what the play looks like. You've been to it before. You get to the play early, and you go to your seat and you sit down and you look up at the stage and you notice, because you know what it should be, you notice that not everything's in place yet. In fact, stagehands are busily putting props out and putting the set into place. They're still preparing the stage for the play that will take place on that stage. Okay, if you sit down and they're still getting things ready, things are not in place, you know that the play is not about to start. However, when the last prop is put into place and all of the set is ready and the stagehands leave the stage, then you know, okay, the play could start at any time. No one knows when the end is coming. However, descriptions of these end events given to us in the Bible describe those events in such a way that we can see props and set pieces that must be in place before the end begins. And this morning, I want to share 4 of those props with you. 4 signs of the end times that must come to pass before the beginning of the end. Now, Pastor Jeff, why did you choose these four? Here's why. Because these four signs, at least at some point in history, were the least likely to take place. Some things getting ready for the end times are easy, but some are very difficult. And at the time they were discussed, seemed to be absolutely impossible. There are four of them. The first sign of the end times is the regathering of the Jewish people. The regathering of the Jewish people. Over and over again in Scripture, it is clear that the Jews, at the end of the age, the Jews will be back in their ancient homeland in Israel. Now, the reason I want to bring that up is that has not been true for very long. In fact, since the 6th century BC, world empires have conquered and occupied what is their ancient homeland, the nation of Israel, and dispersed Jews all over the world. There has not been an Israel. Now, how do we know that there needs to be an Israel for the end to take place? All right, there are many passages I could point to. I'm going to point to probably my favorite. In fact, if somebody asked me, Pastor Jeff, what is your favorite chapter, not book, what is your favorite chapter in all the Bible? I would have to say Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9 is a mind-boggling chapter. And in this chapter, Daniel, the prophet, is having a conversation with the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel is talking to Daniel about Daniel's people and Daniel's holy city. Okay, well, who is Daniel's people? That's the Jews. What was Daniel's holy city? That's Jerusalem. So Gabriel is telling Daniel what is going to happen to the Jews and to Jerusalem at the end of time. And listen to what Gabriel says. Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy, that's the Antichrist, will destroy the city, Jerusalem, and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Verse 27, watch this. He, the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. What is that? That's 7 years. He will confirm a 7-year treaty, a covenant. In the middle of that 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, referring to temple worship. And at the temple in Jerusalem, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Okay, I know I'm lifting these verses out of context. Let me explain to you what's happening here. Gabriel tells Daniel, at the end, a world leader, the Antichrist himself, is going to broker a peace treaty that includes the nation of Israel. Look, we all know everyone's been trying to get peace in the Middle East. But this person, the Antichrist, will actually broker a peace deal, a peace treaty, a covenant that includes the nation of Israel. And then, 3.5 years after that 7-year treaty is signed, 3.5 years in, the Antichrist will break the covenant and will turn on the Jewish people and desecrate their temple. Okay, there is a lot that needs to be said about that. There are probably about 5 good sermons in that passage alone. Here's what I want you to take away. In order for anyone to broker a peace treaty with Israel, Israel has to exist. That's pretty simple. I'll give you an example. So it would not make any sense for our government to say, you know what we really need? We really need a peace treaty with the Greek Empire. We think, what are they? Are they lost it? Why is that? Because the Greek Empire doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't make sense to broker a peace treaty with a nation that does not exist. And yet that's exactly what's going to happen in the end. As I said, Israel has been dispersed all over the world except until 1948. Many of you know this. 1948, the United Nations made it possible for Jews to return to their ancient homeland in the land of Israel. And listen to this. By 2009, there were more Jews living in Jerusalem than anywhere in Israel than in any other parts of the world, and that had not happened since the 2nd century. The Jewish people are being regathered to their ancient homeland. I want to read you a quote by Randall Price. Here's what he said about this. The modern return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel has been called the miracle on the Mediterranean. Such a return by a people group that had been scattered among the nations is unprecedented in history. Indeed, the Jewish people are the only exiled people to remain a distinct people despite being dispersed to more than 70 different countries for more than 20 centuries. Watch this. The mighty empires of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome all ravaged their land and took their people captive and scattered them throughout the earth. Even after this, they, the Jews, suffered persecution, pogrom, and Holocaust in the lands to which they were exiled. Yet all these ancient kingdoms have turned to dust. But the Jewish people, whom they enslaved and tried to eradicate, live free and have again become a strong nation. One of the props that has to be in place before the end can begin is the regathering of the Jewish people. Church, that prop is in place. Here's a second one. A second sign of the end times is surging apostasy, fueled by spiritual and moral gullibility. Here's what's going to happen. Literally, the entire world is going to accept, support, and follow an evil world leader empowered by Satan himself. Now, you scratch your head and say, why on earth would anybody want to support and follow, devote themselves to an evil leader empowered by Satan himself? Here's why. Here's how that happens. People are going to be spiritually and morally gullible. Paul wrote to Timothy about this. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. The Spirit clearly says that in later times, some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits, and watch this, and things taught by demons. People are actually going to follow the teachings of demons. Such teaching came through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. Here's what I want you to see. The spiritual and moral gullibility necessary for the world to embrace and follow an evil world leader is present today. Church, you know this. People today will believe just about anything. There is a spiritual and moral gullibility that unlike of which the world has never seen before, because people are so willing to embrace crazy moral and spiritual things. Objective truth and reason is out the window. Unfortunately, tragically, it's a sad thing. that there are many examples of spiritual and moral gullibility. Perhaps the most pervasive and most obvious has to do with elements of the sexual revolution that we're seeing in our world today. For example, if a man thinks he is a woman or feels like he is a woman, then it doesn't matter what the facts say, he is a woman. And culture buys that. They support that. Even, look, and I'm not talking about wackos, the United States Supreme Court affirms such things. People will believe anything regardless of what the facts say. Here's another alarm. I was reading this past week. Right now, there are efforts to normalize pedophilia as an unchangeable sexual orientation. Get a load of that. Now you say, Pastor Jeff, we're never going to protect pedophiles who sexually abuse children. We're never going to protect them as a certain sexual orientation like we have all these others. Oh, yes, we will. Yes, we will. You know why? You know why culture will do that? Because this culture is morally and spiritually gullible. They will believe anything. So how is it at the end times that the entire world will embrace and follow an evil leader empowered by Satan himself? For exactly the same reasons they will believe anything today. See, this surging apostasy and this spiritual and moral gullibility, that is a prop that is already in place today. Sign of the time number 3. By the end, there will be the reemergence of a world empire. Okay, now this is kind of where things start sounding a little weird. Because when we think of world empires, we think of things that are long past. Okay, when we think of the last world empire was Rome. I mean, that's been centuries and centuries. But world empires are not possible today because nations of the world are sovereign. They are free. They are independent from each other. And they have fought for that sovereignty. They have fought for that independence. So this notion that there would be a world empire sounds a bit far-fetched. And yet Daniel describes a world empire that will arise. Daniel and others describe a world empire that will arise during the end times. Daniel chapter 7, I'll read 2 verses. Let me pause right here. I know that I am leaving a lot out. By the end of this series, I am going to have resources available for you back at our resource center. For those of you who want to know more, who want to go deeper, okay, that's coming. I worked on it this past week. I've got some great resources coming. But for now, you're just going to have to take my word for it. Okay, so I know I'm leaving a lot out. Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. Listen to what Daniel says. It sounds a little weird. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left, a superpower. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Now, that's a funny looking picture so far. Go down to verse 24. Then the 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. I know I'm only glossing the surface, but here's what Daniel's describing. He is describing a world empire that will arise, that will be made possible by the unification of several different countries to make up this worldwide empire, this empire that can control the entire world. Now, Pastor Jeff, why would any sovereign country give up its sovereignty, give up its independence to join something bigger over which it is not sovereign? Here's the answer to that question. For exactly the same reason, there is a growing appetite today to give up individual sovereignty for the protection and security something larger offers or promises. We see this movement today, especially in our country. Depending on what happens in the next, few months, the United States of America could be socialist. It could be. The USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republic, we could be the USSA, United States Socialists of America. That could be our future. Now, why is that? Why is there this move towards socialism? Because individuals are more than willing, they're eager to give up their own sovereignty, give up their own freedoms, give up their own liberties for the protection and security offered by a larger government. In other words, they're willing to give the government authority over their lives to take care of them rather than have the freedom to take care of themselves. We see that. This is a growing movement in our world today. The same thing is going to happen on an international scale. These sovereign countries are going to seek refuge in a larger governmental structure for security and protection and economic prosperity at the end. One example of this is the EU. We see this, the European Union. The European Union is far more than just a group of European allies. They're not just countries who get along with each other and are friends. No. The European Union is a consortium of over 24 countries. And the EU enacts legislation that governs all of those countries. It enforces immigration among those countries. You can't have borders if you're in one of those countries. You got to let people move freely. They set the terms for trade agreements in that consortium. All of these, what was Brexit all about? Remember Brexit? The UK voted, we're out of here. What was that all about? Here's what it was about. One of the members of the European Union wanted its sovereignty back. They wanted its independence back. They didn't want to have to play by the European Union's rules anymore. They wanted to be their own country, take care of themselves, provide for themselves. That's what Brexit was all about. But at the end, there is going to be a consortium of nations made possible by this desire for protection and security and economic prosperity that will tee up the end of the world, because the Antichrist will ultimately rule it all. Now, some people ask, is the EU the 10 horns that Daniel saw? No, nobody knows. No, we don't know the answer to that. All I'm trying to suggest is the EU is an example of an appetite for a consortium of countries that looks very much like what Daniel prophesied about. One final thing, one final prop that absolutely must be in place before the end can begin is globalism. Globalism. Now, this is one of those that not too long ago was not here. We didn't have we did not live in a global world, making many of the descriptions of the end times seem very, very far-fetched. Here's what I mean by globalism. The world will need to be a small place. Okay, like a better way to say it. To be a small place so that a single centralized government and even a single individual can control it. Control it how? Well, control it economically, control communication and media, control military power. Now, a few years ago, these abilities were not real. We were not able to do all of those things. It would have been impossible for a single person to control all of those things. But let me give you a couple of examples of what the end times are going to look like that points toward globalism. Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 and 17. It, speaking of the right-hand man of the Antichrist, it also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads. Now, what was that for? So that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Okay, in the end times, at the end, here's what's going to happen. Individuals will not be able to buy or sell anything unless the one in authority approves of it. Now, not too long ago, you'd think to yourself, well, how is that possible? But think about it. Today, banking is all electronic. Chances are you pay all of your bills or most of your bills electronically. Banking transfers for large purchases as well as small transactions. All of those things are electronic. In fact, I have a credit card in my wallet, and I can take that credit card anywhere in the world almost, and use it just as if I were here in the United States. Why? Because banking is so global now. All transactions are global. Several years ago, true story, before the United States required the little chips to be in the credit cards, you know what I'm talking about? The little chips, chip reader. The United Kingdom got there first. They required chips to be on all their credit cards before we did. Well, we took a trip to the UK one year, and I went into the grocery store, and as I always did, I was ready to pay, and I handed my credit card to the lady. And she said, "I'm sorry, sir, we can't accept your payment." And I said, "Why? I've been buying groceries over here for years. What's the deal?" She said, "You don't have the chip. You don't have the chip." They wouldn't take my credit card because I didn't have the chip. You see, it is very, very possible for what you can buy and sell to be controlled by a centralized agency or a centralized person today because of the electronic nature of banking. Here's another way globalism must be present before the end comes. Everyone in the world, think about this. Now think about this a couple decades ago, a few decades ago. Everyone in the world must be able to see an event happening at the same time. Everyone see it at the same time. Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. This is talking about Jesus' second coming. "Look, he is coming with the clouds, and" watch this, "every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him." Now here's what I suspect. I suspect when Christians living in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and on, read that, they're thinking, well, wait a minute. How is a single event going to be seen by everyone in the entire world? That is impossible. And yet today, these are all over the world. You know what I can do with this? I can stream a video that I take right here. I can stream it all over the world. You better believe when Jesus busts the clouds open and comes back a second time, it is going to be plastered on social media. The entire world is going to be able to see that as it happens, and that's only been made possible relatively recently. The world leader is going to control communications, economies. He's also going to control military power. I won't go into this, but until the last 100 years, missile technologies did not exist. You know, the ability to control a nation or to attack a nation on the other side of the world was not there, and yet we have that today. Globalism is a prop that must be in place before the end, and it's there. Pastor Jeff, when is the end going to begin? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. However, all the props seem to be in place. The stage is set, and the play can begin at any moment. The question is, are you ready for the end? Our timeline starts in ages past but it goes to ages to come. You know what that is? That's your eternity. You live forever. And you live forever in one of two places. The Bible only gives two options. You're either going to spend eternity in heaven with God, or you're going to spend eternity in hell apart from God. The Bible is very clear on this teaching. The question is, where will you spend your ages to come? Well, Pastor Jeff, what's the difference between those who spend eternity in heaven and those who spend eternity in hell? There's only one difference. It has nothing to do with how much good you do, how kind you are, how nice you are to other people, how much money you give, how many times you come to church. All those things are great, but none of those things make the difference. The only difference is that those who go to heaven and spend eternity with God have placed their faith in Jesus to wipe away the sin that separates them from God. Those who go to hell have rejected God's offer. In which camp do you find yourself this morning? Pastor Jeff, I would love to know that God has forgiven my sin, that my slate has been wiped clean before God, so that when I die, I can spend my ages to come in heaven. How can I do that? Well, it's very, very simple. You simply pray and ask God to forgive you for your sin, acknowledging that you believe in what Jesus did for you to save you from your sin. If you would like to do that, I would love to lead you in a prayer. Let's bow our heads, close our eyes. Your prayer doesn't have to sound exactly like this, but it might sound something like this. Dear God, I recognize I've blown it, and I'm in desperate need of your forgiveness. I believe Jesus, your Son, came to this earth, died on a cross for me, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead. And right now, I place all of my trust in what Jesus did for me to rescue me from my own sin so that my slate can be clean. Accept me into your family and into your heaven as I accept Jesus into my life. In his name I pray, amen. Okay, everybody looking this way, if you're in the room and you prayed along with me, you have just made the most important decision you will ever make in your life, because the decision you just made affects your eternity. One of the things that we take very seriously here is helping people understand what that means. One of the ways that we help you understand that decision is by offering you literature. If you're here in the room, please go by guest services on your way out. It's out in the grand foyer. Go by, they have some literature prepared to hand to you. You can receive that and be on your way. Now, if you're watching online, we'd love to mail that same literature to you. You can give us your mailing address in one of several ways. If you're watching on our website, just above the video box you're watching is a decision response form link. Just click that, fill the form out, submit it to us, and your literature will be on its way. If you're watching on Facebook, that same form can be found in the comments section and on our app on the main homepage. Please take just a minute right now and send your mailing address so that we can send you that very helpful information. Church, thank you for your attentiveness. This series, we're going to cover a lot of ground, and almost all of you stayed awake this morning, so thank you for that. Thank you for paying attention. We're going to finish with one final song. Let's all stand together as Nathaniel comes to lead us.